Book Talk begins at 14 minutes and 31 seconds. Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 656, Sampled. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by our lovely patrons at patreon.com and our members at YouTube on our channel, Craftlit-channel. And this week we would like to highlight and thank Lily Morris, Lynn Span-Bodlich, Julie Kipp, Lori Hinshaw, and Sharon Lanza. Thank you so much. This would not be possible without you. Well, hello, how are you? I'm going to stop there. I feel like a truck hit me, but that's okay because I don't have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting this week. This week, the chapters lift themselves. This is one of the sections that I have been waiting to get to. I am so excited. But before we get there, there are a couple of things that I did want to share with you. One is I stumbled on a beautiful lecture that was given in Litchfield, I think Connecticut. Is that right? Litchfield, Connecticut? That sounds right. I don't think it's Massachusetts. Anywho, it was a woman who owns a gazillion samplers, like hand-stitched samplers, historical samplers from girls throughout the ages. And, that'll be kind of interesting to leave on in the background while I was getting ready. And I kept stopping and looking. For one thing, you really need to watch this on as big a screen as you can get so that you can zoom in as much as possible, because it's a slide deck that you're watching. And the slide deck is trying to show you the entire sampler instead of zooming in on the details. And I was really interested in the details. So I'm going to be rewatching it again on a bigger screen, not my phone. But the thing that I thought was really, really interesting is that she touches on many of the things that we have talked about on Craftlit over the last 18 and counting years, namely that a lot of the things that women were doing were so commonplace that they didn't require any kind, and require, I'm putting in air quotes, didn't require any kind of written acknowledgement. Of course, we know that a lot of this was because the people who had the time to write the books were usually the men, until Virginia Woolf pointed this out to everybody. And along with that, there certainly were women who were writing things down. We have plenty, and we're finding more all the time, of these kind of household guides and pattern books and things like that from the 17, 18, 1900s. This was a different kind of talk because she loves the work. She loves pointing out. And this was one of her first two slides that I thought, okay, well, now we're in different territory. She showed a contract that was a photostat of a 1740 contract. And it was a guy who signed the contract. And there was a line and a circle on it. And the circle was him making his mark, that this, in fact, was him. He was the one involved. That was how he identified himself, was this kind of drawn circle. His 11-year-old daughter, at the same time, created an incredible sampler that included poetry and a line about herself, and signed it herself. I mean, in stitching, she knew how to spell her name and write it out. Her dad, for whatever reason, couldn't spell his own name. She could stitch the freaking thing. And it's, as the speaker says, it's like Ginger Rogers doing everything backwards but in heels. It's the same thing. And I hadn't really thought about it that way before. She said most people at the time, when the states were pre-state, from Jamestown on, most people were literate. They could read. They could read the pamphlets that were going around, that were the political pamphlets. They could read the Bible. Obviously, for the Puritans who showed up here, that was massively important. Everybody had to learn how to read, boys and girls. This was a different thing to point out. And not only does she draw attention to those kinds of things as she goes through the talk, she's funny also, but she also has, the first time I've ever seen this, samplers that were done by free Black women in Maine. They have a family genealogy written out and on linen. You know, this is stitched into linen because paper was really expensive. Linen was not. So that's another reason why the girls were so literate, is they had something to write on. Two of these women in this family were verified people on the Underground Railroad, helping to get freedom seekers. And she's very specific about this. She said, if you call them escaped slaves, there's some kind of romance that gets mixed in there. Like, oh, they're escaped. You know, it's like the Count of Monte Cristo escaping from the Chateau d'If. No, this was not escaping from slavery. This was finding freedom, people. She's really good about that. And she's just so jazzed about having found this piece of history that we just don't see very often, much less talk about. So I loved that. I loved the sampler thing. I love the fact that she also pointed out that the reason we have so many samplers still, where we don't have necessarily a whole lot of clothing, I mean, people certainly wore clothing, but we don't have a lot of it that's lasted for 200, 300, 400 years. That's because the samplers, when girls were making these samplers, these were real points of pride. And she doesn't mention this, but I know that this is also true. A young girl would work on a sampler and they would hang it up in the house, whether that meant tacking it to the wall or putting it in a frame, whatever, mounting it on some kind of cardboard or board. These things got displayed. So that's one of the reasons why they've lasted. They were often not exposed to sunlight because the place in the room where they were located was next to a window instead of having a window face onto them. And the other thing that she didn't mention that I thought was interesting is this was also an advertisement for husbands, because if a guy came along and said, oh, look at this fabulous stitch work, when he's courting her, that's just one more tick in her favor. But the idea that these pieces of history have been preserved and that we actually do know so much about these girls and young women who were creating these textiles and pieces of art. And I just thought, I used to think of samplers as the thing people did first because it was a baby step, and it's not. They had a lot of needle practice before they started on the sampler. The sampler is like their master's degree. It's like, I have mastered these stitches. I can do these things now. And when you see that some of the samplers are done by kids who were 5, it becomes all that much more impressive. So I thought that was marvelous and very happy making, and I loved it. And so the link to that video is in the show notes or in the description below if you're watching on YouTube. And that just made me happy. The other thing I wanted to do was show you a couple of things. This is the birthday card that I got from Anne Blanton, who we know and love on the show. It was a beautiful birthday card of a teacup, an embroidered teacup with an embroidered teapot and flower bag next to it. The reason why I am not holding the bag right now is because it's already been pressed into work for me. So thank you, Anne. The other thing I wanted to show you is something that I've been working on. Again, trying to find a pleasant way to spend mindful time while I'm on my back. Not always easy. And a lot of it is what we've talked about many times in the past, that feeling like you are being productive it's good. You don't want to be productive at the cost of your health, obviously, but we like knowing that we are doing something. And I had gotten years ago a giant vintagey antique. Some of the fabrics look like they are from at least the 30s. I don't think they're before the 30s, but some of them are from the 30s, all the way up into, I think, the late 60s, maybe early 70s. But it was a yo-yo quilt. And I don't particularly like yo-yo quilts, but I do like the yo-yos. I don't know why. I think sometimes they're called puffs as well in other parts of the world. I think so. So when you take a circle and you stitch around the circle and then you pull up the gathered threads, and so one side, if you turned it over, would be flat and the other side has the little drawstring section where it's all gathered up. I don't really like those quilts, but I liked playing with them. And last year for my aunt's birthday, I made her a pillow. I have a raw silk background, and I did kind of a floral arrangement with buttons and some of these yo-yos. Well, I couldn't do much last week, so I was lying in bed with a seam ripper, pulling apart the entire quilt and separating the yo-yos out into color groups. And then the one day this week that I did manage to go out, Andrew and I went to breakfast and then walked across the street to this antique store. I just knew I needed to go there. There was something that I needed, and walked around on the ground floor. And it's one of those big, it's like a mall. It's a whole bunch of different areas of this large building, and each area is worked by one particular collector or estate seller or antique person. I'd found some beautiful hand linens in this one section before, and things like glasses, and there's a lot of cool stuff at this place. But I walked around the corner and I saw a tin on the floor that was open, and it was full of buttons. And I was looking at him going, those are pretty buttons. And I bent down and looked at the tag on them, and they're all mother of pearl, all clearly taken off of things. Some of them match, most of them don't. And I thought, I know what I'm going to do with these. And so I came home and I took a big old piece of denim that I had that was used to be actually a pair of Aiden's jeans. And I took this torn piece of denim and I just started stitching yo-yos onto the denim and created this kind of floral cascade. I don't think I'm done with it yet, but I actually might put it up on Etsy when I am done. I think it needs some green to make it very clear that these are flowers. But yeah, I was really, really happy with this. And I have pictures that are in the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can see some of the close-ups. There you can see some of the fabrics that are quite definitely older than others. And you can see close-ups of some of the buttons. Some of them are tiny, tiny, tiny little buttons, and some of them were like big honking things. But I also decided I wanted to back it. I didn't want the backing to just be, the back of the denim with all the stitching all over it. So I also stitched up the back with what is considered a honeycomb stitch, I guess. It's kind of like a blanket stitch around the edges. And then I thought, I'm just going to keep going. And so it actually looks, because it's on a piece of felted, kind of a gray-brown wool sweater, it also kind of looks like bark on the back, and I've have it suspended from a stick. So it is like a piece of wall art that I have never done anything like this before, but it's certainly one of a kind, and I think I'm going to put it up on Etsy when I'm actually happy with it. So that's my new sampler. I sampled certainly a lot of the honeycomb stitch. I also stitched in, let's see if I can do this, May 13th, 2024, and then I have my little chop that I've embroidered into the back. And as we know, historically, embroidery has not been my jam. So I must have slowed down a lot to be doing that. Anyway, Emma, I mentioned that we're doing 3 chapters this week, chapter 13, 14, and 15. We are still in volume 1. There's a few words, and then there's just some fun stuff to talk about at the end. Putrid, putrefaction, putrescence. I looked this up to see if there was a nice meaning for it. A putrid sore throat or a putrid infectious sore throat is usually referring to something like strep throat. It's something where it don't smell good. There's just no other way to put it. So I looked up in the OED, and yes, it's not that it's not complimentary of the person. It's just, yeah, you really don't want to be around somebody when they are sick with a putrid infectious sore throat. That would not be pleasant. You're going to hear a reference to arranged the glasses. This is when they're in a carriage, and that sounds very strange. I think they had isinglass at this point, which would have been like mica sheets almost that you could use for glass in carriages. I don't think they had I mean, certainly in the city, once there was pavement, you could have some glass in the carriages. But for the most part, I think in the interiors of closed carriages at this time, you certainly had little curtains that you could draw down, but also they had some kind of a covering that allowed light in, that they are referring to as glass. In today's chapters, listen to Mr. Elton and his verbal tics. He has, just like Harriet has things that she says that are like her particular flourishes in her language, Mr. Elton has the same kind of flourishes that are identifiably him. It's just another thing that Jane Austen does really well. Everybody sounds like themselves. One of the things that he says, and it's a funny rest of the sentence that I will not spoil for you, but he talks about what an excellent device. And he means like invention or inventive use of something that is otherwise quite normal. And I will leave it to you to listen to what he thinks is so bitchin', because it's nothing that we wouldn't be used to. Sennight, SE apostrophe NNIGHT, is a 7 night. So that's 1 week. A sweep gate and a sweep. This was as you would expect. If you were driving a carriage up to somebody's home, so somebody's nice home, there would be a kind of a rounded drive, a sweep, so that you could take the horses in up one side and then drop people off at the front door and then just keep going so that you didn't have to try and back up the horses and the carriages, which is never fun. So that's sweep and sweep gate. I do not know if that terminology is still used. My grandparents had a house that had basically a sweep. I don't remember anybody talking about it that way, but I was also a kid, so what did I know? Put dash off. This sounds like a very modern phrasing to me. I don't think it is. I think it is literally to put something off is to postpone it. It's not a put off like, they don't really want to see you anymore. I don't think there's any weight given to that phrase in the text today. Drawing room. I know we've talked about this before. I decided to look it up in the OED. So we know that drawing room by this time, by the early 1800s, was really the withdrawing room. They no longer use the phrase withdrawing, but I went and looked withdrawing up in the OED, and the first time it's used in this way, as the room one would withdraw to after talking and eating and all that stuff. And it didn't used to be gender segregated. It used to just be where you go sit after eating. The phrase withdrawing room started being used in 1591. So it's been around for a while. I couldn't find any kind of definite time when it switched from withdrawing just to drawing, but it was well in place by the time Jane Austen was writing. Sanguine. Last week we talked about the humors when Mr. Perry was bilious, and there's the humors and all the kind of Aristotelian ways of looking at health. One of those other words is sanguine, like exsanguinate. A vampire exsanguinates their victims. They suck all the blood out. So sanguine has to do with blood. So a sanguine complexion could mean ruddy. It could mean out of breath, and therefore the blood is in your cheeks and you're all excited. Or it could mean sanguine, passionate. I'd always thought of sanguine being a reference to somebody kind of being slow and tired. And I think that's because I first really paid attention to it around the concept of bloodletting. So that kind of attitude that I attributed to sanguine may or may not be true. The first time you hear it used today, it's more talking about being optimistic. Like, I'm calm, I'm sanguine about that. It's all going to be fine. I got good vibes. The second time you hear it used, it is going to be referring to the bright, the blood showing up in somebody's face in a way that indicates either that they are full of alcohol or full of passion or both. Just putting that out there. Teased is a word that gets used in this middle chapter today, chapter 14. Teased, Teazed, which is like teasing a cat. You are frustrating the cat. A teaser is, we think of as, or we're supposed to think of, as being kind of a fun thing. Like, ooh, that's a tease. We get to see what the new movie's going to be like. Here's a taste of it. Teasing isn't always fun for the teasee. We all know that. Do remember that the word spirits, and therefore the phrase good spirits, could refer to how much one has had to drink, and therefore what one's mood might be like. It's Austen being punny. Just giving you a heads up. The word temper is used in this chapter in the same kind of way that like Ruth and ruthless gets used. It's easy to forget that temper is actually composure. So if you lose your temper, you are losing that stillness, that composure, that keeping it togetherness that is, we hope, inside us all more often than not. But yes, behaving with temper doesn't mean a temper tantrum. Behaving with temper means you are modulating yourself. We've now moved from a putrid infectious throat to a ulcerated sore throat. That's usually, we've moved away from strep throat into probably scarlet fever territory if we're talking about ulcerated sore throats. Just so you know, unexampled, unprecedented. There are no other examples of this thing. I actually like unexampled better than unprecedented in our modern context. I'm getting tired of all the unprecedented stuff. Unexampled. That's a good word. Without scruple is without hesitation. Half and half state is half drunk, half sober. There's drinking in these chapters. If you're in a carriage that is going at a foot pace, the horse is walking and not walking quickly. The horse is walking no faster than a human could walk alongside it. And that's all that is. All right. Those are all the things that I wanted you to be thinking of as we head into these 3 chapters. Again, these are some of my favorite chapters in the book. And if it works out, I have a special treat for you after we listen to these chapters. So if you are listening to your own version of this book, you can fast wind to 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 5 seconds. Otherwise, here we go. Chapters 13, 14, and 15 of Emma by Jane Austen.
Chapter 13. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley, in this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children, and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. She had nothing to wish otherwise, but that the days did not pass so swiftly. It was a delightful visit, perfect in being much too short. In general their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial. They must all dine at Randalls one day. Even Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to think it a possible thing in preference to a division of the party. How they were all to be conveyed he would have made a difficulty if he could, but as his son and daughter's carriage and horses were actually at Hartfield, he was not able to make more than a simple question on that head. It hardly amounted to a doubt, nor did it occupy Emma long to convince him that they might in one of the carriages find room for Harriet also. Harriet, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley, their own especial set, were the only persons invited to meet them. The hours were to be early, as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclination being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event, for it was a very great event that Mr. Woodhouse should dine out on the 24th of December, had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home so much indisposed with a cold that, but for her own earnest wish of being nursed by Mrs. Goddard, Emma could not have allowed her to leave the house. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randalls. She was very feverish, and had a bad sore throat. Mrs. Goddard was full of care and affection. Mr. Perry was talked of, and Harriet herself was too ill and low to resist the authority which excluded her from this delightful engagement, though she could not speak of her loss without many tears. Emma sat with her as long as she could, to attend her in Mrs. Goddard's unavoidable absences, and raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton's would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of his having a most comfortless visit, and of their all missing her very much. She had not advanced many yards from Mrs. Goddard's door, when she was met by Mr. Elton himself, evidently coming towards it, and as they walked on slowly together in conversation about the invalid, of whom he, on the rumour of considerable illness, had been going to inquire, that he might carry some report of her to Hartfield, they were overtaken by Mr. John Knightley returning from the daily visit to Donwell, with his two eldest boys, whose healthy, glowing faces showed all the benefit of country run, and seemed to ensure a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for. They joined company and proceeded together. Emma was just describing the nature of her friend's complaint. A throat very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her, a quick low pulse, etc., and she was sorry to find from Mrs. Goddard that Harriet was liable to very bad sore throats, and had often alarmed her with them. Mr. Elton looked all alarm on the occasion, as he exclaimed, "A sore throat! I hope not infectious. I hope not of a putrid infectious sort. Has Perry seen her? Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as of your friend. Let me entreat you to run no risks. Why does not Perry see her?" Emma, who was not at all frightened herself, tranquillized this excess of apprehension by assurances of Mrs. Goddard's experience and care, but as there must still remain a degree of uneasiness which she could not wish to reason away, which she would rather feed and assist than not, she added soon afterwards, as if quite another subject, "It is so cold, so very cold, and looks and feels so very much like snow, that if it were to any other place or with any other party, I should really try not to go out to-day, and dissuade my father from venturing. But as he has made up his mind, and does not seem to feel the cold himself, I do not like to interfere, as I know it would be so great a disappointment to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But upon my word, Mr. Elton, in your case I should certainly excuse myself. You appear to me a little hoarse already, and when you consider what demand of voice and what fatigues to-morrow will bring, I think it would be no more than common prudence to stay at home and take care of yourself to-night." Mr. Elton looked as if he did not very well know what answer to make, which was exactly the case. For though very much gratified by the kind care of such a fair lady, and not liking to resist any advice of hers, he had not really the least inclination to give up the visit. But Emma, too eager and busy in her own previous conceptions and views to hear him impartially, or see him with clear vision, was very well satisfied with his muttering acknowledgment of its being "very cold, certainly very cold," and walked on, rejoicing in having extricated him from Randalls, and secured him the power of sending to inquire after Harriet every hour of the evening. "You do quite right," said she. "We will make your apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Weston." But hardly had she so spoken, when she found her brother was civilly offering a seat in his carriage, if the weather were Mr. Elton's only objection, and Mr. Elton actually accepting the offer with much prompt satisfaction. It was a done thing. Mr. Elton was to go, and never had his broad, handsome face expressed more pleasure than at this moment. Never had his smile been stronger, nor his eyes more exulting than when he next looked at her. "Well," said she to herself, "this is most strange. After I had got him off so well, to choose to go into company, and leave Harriet ill behind. Most strange indeed. But there is, I believe, in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their employments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives way to it. And this must be the case with Mr. Elton. A most valuable, amiable, pleasing young man, undoubtedly, and very much in love with Harriet. But still he cannot refuse an invitation. He must dine out whenever he is asked. What a strange thing love is! He can see ready wit in Harriet, but will not dine alone for her." Soon afterwards Mr. Elton quitted them, and she could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice, while assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report, and he sighed and smiled himself off in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favour. After a few minutes of entire silence between them, John Knightley began with, "I never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It is downright labour to him where ladies are concerned. With men he can be rational and unaffected, but when he has ladies to please, every feature works." "Mr. Elton's manners are not perfect," replied Emma, "but where there is a wish to please, one ought to overlook, and one does overlook a great deal. Where a man does his best with only moderate powers, he will have the advantage over negligent superiority. There is such perfect good temper and good will in Mr. Elton as one cannot but value." "Yes," said Mr. John Knightley presently, with some slyness, "he seems to have a great deal of good will towards you." "Me?" she replied with a smile of astonishment. "Are you imagining me to be Mr. Elton's object?" "Such an imagination has crossed me, I own, Emma, and if it never occurred to you before, you may as well take it into consideration now." "Mr. Elton in love with me! What an idea!" "I do not say it is so, but you will do well to consider whether it is or not, and to regulate your behaviour accordingly. I think your manners to him encouraging. I speak as a friend, Emma. You had better look about you, and ascertain what you do and what you mean to do." "I thank you, but I assure you, you are quite mistaken. Mr. Elton and I are very good friends, and nothing more." And she walked on, amusing herself in the consideration of the blunders which often arise from a partial knowledge of circumstances, of the mistakes which people of high pretensions to judgment are for ever falling into, and not very well pleased with her brother for imagining her blind and ignorant and in want of counsel. He said no more. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit, that in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others, too full of the wonder of his own going, and the pleasure it was to afford at Randalls to see that it was cold, and too well wrapped up to feel it. The cold, however, was severe, and by the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humour. The preparing and the going abroad in such weather, with the sacrifice of his children after dinner, were evils, were disagreeables at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. "A man," said he, "must have a very good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside, and encounter such a day as this for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It is the greatest absurdity. Actually snowing at this moment. The folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man, in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself, and keep all under shelter that he can. Here we are, setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said and heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again to-morrow. Going in dismal weather, to return probably in worse, 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing but to convey 5 idle shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home." Emma did not find herself equal to give the pleased assent which no doubt he was in the habit of receiving, to emulate the "Very true, my love," which must have been usually administered by his travelling companion, but she had resolution enough to refrain from making any answer at all. She could not be complying, she dreaded being quarrelsome, her heroism reached only to silence. She allowed him to talk and arrange the glasses, and wrapped herself up without opening her lips. They arrived, the carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black, and smiling, was with them instantly. Emma thought with pleasure of some change of subject. Mr. Elton was all obligation and cheerfulness. He was so very cheerful in his civilities indeed, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet from what had reached her. She had sent while dressing, and the answer had been much the same, not better. "My report from Mrs. Goddard's," said she presently, "was not so pleasant as I had hoped. Not better was my answer." His face lengthened immediately, and his voice was the voice of sentiment as he answered. "Oh, no, I am grieved to find. I was on the point of telling you that when I had called at Mrs. Goddard's door, which I did the very last thing before I turned to dress, I was told that Miss Smith was not better, by no means better, rather worse, very much grieved and concerned. I had flattered myself that she must be better after such a cordial as I knew she had been given in the morning." Emma smiled and answered, "My visit was of use to the nervous part of her complaint, I hope. When not even I can charm away a sore throat, it is a most severe cold indeed. Mr. Perry has been with her, as you probably heard." "Yes, I imagined, that is, I did not." "He has been used to her in these complaints, and I hope to-morrow morning will bring us both a more comfortable report. But it is impossible not to feel uneasiness. Such a sad loss to our party to-day." "Dreadful! Exactly so indeed. She will be missed at every moment." This was very proper. The sigh which accompanied it was really estimable, but it should have lasted longer. Emma was rather in dismay when only half a minute afterwards he began to speak of other things, and in a voice of the greatest alacrity and enjoyment. "What an excellent device!" said he, "the use of a sheepskin for carriages! How very comfortable they make it! Impossible to feel cold with such precautions. The contrivances of modern days indeed have rendered a gentleman's carriage perfectly complete. One is so fenced and guarded from the weather that not a breath of air can find its way unpermitted. Weather becomes absolutely of no consequence. It is a very cold afternoon, but in this carriage we know nothing of the matter. Ah, snows a little, I see." "Yes," said John Knightley, "and I think we shall have a good deal of it." "Christmas weather," observed Mr. Elton. "Quite seasonable, and extremely fortunate we may think ourselves that it did not begin yesterday, and prevent this day's party, which it might very possibly have done, for Mr. Woodhouse would hardly have ventured had there been much snow on the ground. But now it is of no consequence. This is quite the season indeed for friendly meetings. At Christmas everybody invites their friends about them, and people think little of even the worst weather. I was snowed up at a friend's house once for a week. Nothing could be pleasanter. I went for only one night, and could not get away till that very day se'nnight." Mr. John Knightley looked as if he did not comprehend the pleasure, but only said, coolly, "I cannot wish to be snowed up a week at Randalls." At another time Emma might have been amused, but she was too much astonished now at Mr. Elton's spirits for other feelings. Harriet seemed quite forgotten in the expectation of a pleasant party. "We are sure of excellent fires," continued he, "and everything in the greatest comfort. Charming people, Mr. and Mrs. Weston. Mrs. Weston, indeed, is much beyond praise, and he is exactly what one values, so hospitable, and so fond of society. It will be a small party, but where small parties are select, they are perhaps the most agreeable of any. Mr. Weston's dining-room does not accommodate more than 10 comfortably, and for my part I would rather, under such circumstances, fall short by 2 than exceed by 2. I think you will agree with me," turning with a soft air to Emma. "I think I shall certainly have your approbation, though Mr. Knightley, perhaps, from being used to the large parties of London, may not quite enter into our feelings." "I know nothing of the large parties of London, sir. I never dine with anybody." "Indeed!" in a tone of wonder and pity. "I had no idea that the law had been so great a slavery. Well, sir, the time must come when you will be paid for all this, when you will have little labour and great enjoyment." "My first enjoyment," replied John Knightley as they passed through the sweep-gate, "will be to find myself safe at Hartfield again." Chapter 14. Some change of countenance was necessary for each gentleman as they walked into Mrs. Weston's drawing-room. Mr. Elton must compose his joyous looks, and Mr. John Knightley disperse his ill-humour. Mr. Elton must smile less, and Mr. John Knightley more, to fit them for the place. Emma only might be as nature prompted, and show herself just as happy as she was. To her it was real enjoyment to be with the Westons. Mr. Weston was a great favourite, and there was not a creature in the world to whom she spoke with such unreserve as to his wife, not any one to whom she related with such conviction of being listened to and understood, of being always interesting and always intelligible, the little affairs, arrangements, perplexities, and pleasures of her father and herself. She could tell nothing of Hartfield, in which Mrs. Weston had not a lively concern, and half an hour's uninterrupted communication of all those little matters on which the daily happiness of private life depends, was one of the first gratifications of each. This was a pleasure which perhaps the whole day's visit might not afford, which certainly did not belong to the present half-hour. But the very sight of Mrs. Weston, her smile, her touch, her voice, was grateful to Emma, and she determined to think as little as possible of Mr. Elton's oddities, or of anything else unpleasant, and enjoy all that was enjoyable to the utmost. The misfortune of Harriet's cold had been pretty well gone through before her arrival. Mr. Woodhouse had been safely seated long enough to give the history of it, besides all the history of his own and Isabella's coming, and of Emma's being to follow, and had indeed just got to the end of his satisfaction that James should come and see his daughter, when the others appeared, and Mrs. Weston, who had been almost wholly engrossed by her attentions to him, was able to turn away and welcome her dear Emma. Emma's project of forgetting Mr. Elton for a while made her rather sorry to find, when they had all taken their places, that he was close to her. The difficulty was great of driving his strange insensibility towards Harriet from her mind, while he not only sat at her elbow, but was continually obtruding his happy countenance on her notice, and solicitously addressing her upon every occasion. Instead of forgetting him, his behaviour was such that she could not avoid the internal suggestion of, "Can it really be as my brother imagined? Can it be possible for this man to be beginning to transfer his affections from Harriet to me? Absurd and insufferable! Yet he would be so anxious for her being perfectly warm, and would be so interested about her father, and so delighted with Mrs. Weston, and at last would begin admiring her drawings with so much zeal and so little knowledge as seemed terribly like a would-be lover, and made it some effort with her to preserve her good manners. For her own sake she could not be rude, and for Harriet's, in the hope that all would yet turn out right, she was even positively civil. But it was an effort, especially as something was going on amongst the others, in the most overpowering period of Mr. Elton's nonsense, which she particularly wished to listen to. She heard enough to know that Mr. Weston was giving some information about his son. She heard the words "my son" and "Frank" and "my son" repeated several times over, and from a few other half-syllables very much suspected that he was announcing an early visit from his son. But before she could quiet Mr. Elton, the subject was so completely past that any reviving question from her would have been awkward. Now it so happened that in spite of Emma's resolution of never marrying, there was something in the name, in the idea of Mr. Frank Churchill, which always interested her. She had frequently thought, especially since his father's marriage with Miss Taylor, that if she were to marry, he was the very person to suit her in age, character, and condition. He seemed, by this connection between the families, quite to belong to her. She could not but suppose it to be a match that everybody who knew them must think of. That Mr. and Mrs. Weston did think of it she was very strongly persuaded, and though not meaning to be induced by him, or by anybody else, to give up a situation which she believed more replete with good than any she could change it for, she had a great curiosity to see him, a decided intention of finding him pleasant, of being liked by him to a certain degree, and a sort of pleasure in the idea of their being coupled in their friends' imaginations. With such sensations, Mr. Elton's civilities were dreadfully ill-timed, but she had the comfort of appearing very polite, while feeling very cross, and of thinking that the rest of the visit could not possibly pass without bringing forward the same information again, or the substance of it, from the open-hearted Mr. Weston. So it proved, for when happily released from Mr. Elton, and seated by Mr. Weston at dinner, he made use of the very first interval in the cares of hospitality, the very first leisure from the saddle of mutton, to say to her, "We want only 2 more to be just the right number. I should like to see 2 more here, your pretty little friend, Miss Smith, and my son, and then I should say we were quite complete. I believe you did not hear me telling the others in the drawing-room that we are expecting Frank. I had a letter from him this morning, and he will be with us within a fortnight." Emma spoke with a very proper degree of pleasure, and fully assented to his proposition of Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Smith making their party quite complete. "He has been wanting to come to us," continued Mr. Weston, "ever since September. Every letter has been full of it, but he cannot command his own time. He has those to please who must be pleased, and who, between ourselves, are sometimes to be pleased only by a good many sacrifices. But now I have no doubt of seeing him here about the 2nd week in January." "What a very great pleasure it will be to you, and Mrs. Weston is so anxious to be acquainted with him, that she must be almost as happy as yourself." "Yes, she would be, but that she thinks there will be another put off. She does not depend upon his coming so much as I do. But she does not know the parties so well as I do. The case, you see, is—but this is quite between ourselves. I did not mention a syllable of it in the other room. There are secrets in all families, you know. The case is that a party of friends are invited to pay a visit at Enscombe in January, and that Frank's coming depends upon their being put off. If they are not put off, he cannot stir. But I know they will, because it is a family that a certain lady of some consequence at Enscombe has a particular dislike to. And though it is thought necessary to invite them once in 2 or 3 years, they always are put off when it comes to the point. I have not the smallest doubt of the issue. I am as confident of seeing Frank here before the middle of January as I am of being here myself. But your good friend there," nodding towards the upper end of the table, "has so few vagaries herself, and has been so little used to them at Hartfield, that she cannot calculate on their effects as I have been long in the practice of doing." "I am sorry there should be anything like doubt in the case," replied Emma, "but am disposed to side with you, Mr. Weston. If you think he will come, I shall think so too, for you know Enscombe." "Yes, I have some right to that knowledge, though I have never been at the place in my life. She is an odd woman. But I never allow myself to speak ill of her on Frank's account, for I do believe her to be very fond of him. I used to think she was not capable of being fond of anybody except herself, but she has always been kind to him, in her way, allowing for little whims and caprices, and expecting everything to be as she likes, and it is no small credit, in my opinion, to him that he should excite such an affection, for though I would not say it to anybody else, she has no more heart than a stone to people in general, and the devil of a temper." Emma liked the subject so well that she began upon it to Mrs. Weston very soon after their moving into the drawing-room, wishing her joy, yet observing that she knew the first meeting must be rather alarming. Mrs. Weston agreed to it, but added that she should be very glad to be secure of undergoing the anxiety of a first meeting at the time talked of. "For I cannot depend upon his coming. I cannot be so sanguine as Mr. Weston. I am very much afraid that it will all end in nothing. Mr. Weston, I dare say, has been telling you exactly how the matter stands." "Yes, it seems to depend upon nothing but the ill humour of Mrs. Churchill, which I imagine to be the most certain thing in the world." "My Emma," replied Mrs. Weston, smiling, "what is the certainty of caprice?" Then, turning to Isabella, who had not been attending before, "You must know, my dear Mrs. Knightley, that we are by no means so sure of seeing Mr. Frank Churchill, in my opinion, as his father thinks. It depends entirely upon his aunt's spirits and pleasure, in short, upon her temper. To you, to my 2 daughters, I may venture on the truth. Mrs. Churchill rules at Enscombe, and is a very odd-tempered woman, and his coming now depends upon her being willing to spare him." "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, everybody knows Mrs. Churchill," replied Isabella, "and I am sure I never think of that poor young man without the greatest compassion. To be constantly living with an ill-tempered person must be dreadful. It is what we, happily, have never known anything of, but it must be a life of misery. What a blessing that she never had any children. Poor little creatures, how unhappy she would have made them." Emma wished she had been alone with Mrs. Weston. She should then have heard more. Mrs. Weston would speak to her with a degree of unreserve which she would not hazard with Isabella, and she really believed would scarcely try to conceal anything relative to the Churchills from her, excepting those views on the young man of which her own imagination had already given her such instinctive knowledge. But at present there was nothing more to be said. Mr. Woodhouse very soon followed them into the drawing-room. To be sitting long after dinner was a confinement that he could not endure. Neither wine nor conversation was anything to him, and gladly did he move to those with whom he was always comfortable. While he talked to Isabella, however, Emma found an opportunity of saying, "And so you do not consider this visit from your son as by any means certain? I am sorry for it. The introduction must be unpleasant whenever it takes place, and the sooner it could be over the better." "Yes, and every delay makes one more apprehensive of other delays. Even if this family, the Braithwaites, are put off, I am still afraid that some excuse may be found for his disappointing us. I cannot bear to imagine any reluctance on his side, but I am sure there is a great wish on the Churchills to keep him to themselves. There is jealousy. They are jealous even of his regard for his father. In short, I can feel no dependence on his coming, and I wish Mr. Weston were less sanguine." "He ought to come," said Emma. "If he could only stay a couple of days, he ought to come, and one can hardly conceive a young man's not having it in his power to do as much as that. A young woman, if she fall into bad hands, may be teased, and kept at a distance from those she wants to be with, but one cannot comprehend a young man's being under such restraint as not to be able to spend a week with his father if he likes it." "One ought to be at Enscombe, and know the ways of the family, before one decides upon what he can do," replied Mrs. Weston. "One ought to use the same caution, perhaps, in judging of the conduct of any one individual of any one family, but Enscombe, I believe, certainly must not be judged by general rules. She is so very unreasonable, and everything gives way to her." "But she is so fond of the nephew. He is so very great a favourite. Now, according to my idea of Mrs. Churchill, it would be most natural that while she makes no sacrifice for the comfort of the husband, to whom she owes everything, while she exercises incessant caprice towards him, she should frequently be governed by the nephew, to whom she owes nothing at all." "My dearest Emma, do not pretend with your sweet temper to understand a bad one, or to lay down rules for it. You must let it go its own way. I have no doubt of his having at times considerable influence, but it may be perfectly impossible for him to know beforehand when it will be." Emma listened, and then coolly said, "I shall not be satisfied unless he comes." "He may have a great deal of influence on some points," continued Mrs. Weston, "and on others very little, and among those on which she is beyond his reach, it is but too likely may be this very circumstance of his coming away from them to visit us." Chapter 15. Mr. Woodhouse was soon ready for his tea, and when he had drank his tea he was quite ready to go home, and it was as much as his three companions could do to entertain away his notice of the lateness of the hour, before the other gentlemen appeared. Mr. Weston was chatty and convivial, and no friend to early separations of any sort, but at last the drawing-room party did receive an augmentation. Mr. Elton, in very good spirits, was one of the first to walk in. Mrs. Weston and Emma were sitting together on a sofa. He joined them immediately, and with scarcely an invitation, seated himself between them. Emma, in good spirits too, from the amusement afforded her mind by the expectation of Mr. Frank Churchill, was willing to forget his late improprieties, and be as well satisfied with him as before, and on his making Harriet his first subject, was ready to listen with most friendly smiles. He professed himself extremely anxious about her fair friend, her fair, lovely, amiable friend. Did she know, had she heard anything about her since their being at Randalls, he felt much anxiety. He must confess that the nature of her complaint alarmed him considerably. And in this style he talked on for some time very properly, not much attending to any answer, but altogether sufficiently awake to the terror of a bad sore throat, and Emma was quite in charity with him. But at last there seemed a perverse turn. It seemed all at once as if he were more afraid of its being a bad sore throat on her account than on Harriet's, more anxious that she should escape the infection than that there should be no infection in the complaint. He began with great earnestness to entreat her to refrain from visiting the sick chamber again for the present, to entreat her to promise him not to venture into any such hazard till he had seen Mr. Perry and learnt his opinion, and though she tried to laugh it off and bring the subject back into its proper course, there was no putting an end to his extreme solicitude about her. She was vexed. It did appear, there was no concealing it, exactly like the pretence of being in love with her instead of Harriet, an inconstancy, if real, the most contemptible and abominable, and she had difficulty in behaving with temper. He turned to Mrs. Weston to implore her assistance. Would not she give him her support? Would not she add her persuasions to his, to induce Miss Woodhouse not to go to Mrs. Goddard's, till it was certain that Miss Smith's disorder had no infection? He could not be satisfied without a promise. Would not she give him her influence in procuring it? So scrupulous for others, he continued, and yet so careless for herself. She wanted me to nurse my cold by staying at home to-day, and yet will not promise to avoid the danger of catching an ulcerated sore throat herself. Is this fair, Mrs. Weston? Judge between us. Have not I some right to complain? I am sure of your kind support and aid. Emma saw Mrs. Weston's surprise, and felt that it must be great, at an address which, in words and manner, was assuming to himself the right of first interest in her, and as for herself, she was too much provoked and offended to have the power of directly saying anything to the purpose. She could only give him a look, but it was such a look as she thought must restore him to his senses, and then left the sofa, removing to a seat by her sister, and giving her all her attention. She had not time to know how Mr. Elton took the reproof, so rapidly did another subject succeed, for Mr. John Knightley now came into the room from examining the weather, and opened on them all with the information of the ground being covered with snow, and of its still snowing fast, with a strong drifting wind, concluding with these words to Mr. Woodhouse. "This will prove a spirited beginning of your winter engagements, sir. Something new for your coachman and horses to be making their way through a storm of snow." Poor Mr. Woodhouse was silent from consternation, but everybody else had something to say. Everybody was either surprised or not surprised, and had some question to ask or some comfort to offer. Mrs. Weston and Emma tried earnestly to cheer him and turn his attention from his son-in-law, who was pursuing his triumph rather unfeelingly. "I admired your resolution very much, sir," said he, "in venturing out in such weather, for of course you saw there would be snow very soon. Everybody must have seen the snow coming on. I admired your spirit, and I dare say we shall all get home very well. Another hour or two's snow can hardly make the road impassable, and we are 2 carriages. If one is blown over in the bleak part of the common field, there will be the other at hand. I dare say we shall all be safe at Hartfield before midnight." Mr. Weston, with triumph of a different sort, was confessing that he had known it to be snowing some time, but had not said a word, lest it should make Mr. Woodhouse uncomfortable, and be an excuse for his hurrying away. As to there being any quantity of snow fallen or likely to fall to impede their return, that was a mere joke. He was afraid they would find no difficulty. He wished the road might be impassable, that he might be able to keep them all at Randalls, and with the utmost good-will was sure that accommodation might be found for everybody, calling on his wife to agree with him, that with a little contrivance everybody might be lodged, which she hardly knew how to do, from the consciousness of there being but 2 spare rooms in the house. "What is to be done, my dear Emma? What is to be done?" was Mr. Woodhouse's first exclamation, and all that he could say for some time. To her he looked for comfort, and her assurances of safety, her representation of the excellence of the horses and of James, and of their having so many friends about them, revived him a little. His eldest daughter's alarm was equal to his own. The horror of being blocked up at Randalls while her children were at Hartfield was full in her imagination, and fancying the road to be now just passable for adventurous people, but in a state that admitted no delay, she was eager to have it settled that her father and Emma should remain at Randalls, while she and her husband set forward instantly through all the possible accumulations of drifted snow that might impede them. "You had better order the carriage directly, my love," said she. "I dare say we shall be able to get along, if we set off directly, and if we do come to anything very bad, I can get out and walk. I am not at all afraid. I should not mind walking half the way. I could change my shoes, you know, the moment I got home, and it is not the sort of thing that gives me cold." "Indeed," replied he. "Then, my dear Isabella, it is the most extraordinary sort of thing in the world, for in general everything does give you cold. Walk home? You are prettily shod for walking home, I dare say. It will be bad enough for the horses." Isabella turned to Mrs. Weston for her approbation of the plan. Mrs. Weston could only approve. Isabella then went to Emma, but Emma could not so entirely give up the hope of their all being able to get away, and they were still discussing the point, when Mr. Knightley, who had left the room immediately after his brother's first report of the snow, came back again and told them that he had been out of doors to examine, and could answer for there not being the smallest difficulty in their getting home whenever they liked it, either now or an hour hence. He had gone beyond the sweep, some way along the Highbury road. The snow was nowhere above half an inch deep, in many places hardly enough to whiten the ground. A very few flakes were falling at present, but the clouds were parting, and there was every appearance of its being soon over. He had seen the coachman, and they both agreed with him in there being nothing to apprehend. To Isabella the relief of such tidings was very great, and they were scarcely less acceptable to Emma on her father's account, who was immediately set as much at ease on the subject as his nervous constitution allowed. But the alarm that had been raised could not be appeased so as to admit of any comfort for him while he continued at Randalls. He was satisfied of there being no present danger in returning home, but no assurances could convince him that it was safe to stay, and while the others were variously urging and recommending, Mr. Knightley and Emma settled it in a few brief sentences, thus: "Your father will not be easy. Why do you not go?" "I am ready, if the others are." "Shall I ring the bell?" "Yes, do." And the bell was rung, and the carriages spoken for. A few minutes more, and Emma hoped to see one troublesome companion deposited in his own house, to get sober and cool, and the other recover his temper and happiness when this visit of hardship were over. The carriage came, and Mr. Woodhouse, always the first object on such occasions, was carefully attended to his own by Mr. Knightley and Mr. Weston, but not all that either could say could prevent some renewal of alarm at the sight of the snow which had actually fallen, and the discovery of a much darker night than he had been prepared for. "He was afraid they should have a very bad drive. He was afraid poor Isabella would not like it. And there would be poor Emma in the carriage behind. He did not know what they had best do. They must keep as much together as they could." And James was talked to, and given a charge to go very slow and wait for the other carriage. Isabella stepped in after her father. John Knightley, forgetting that he did not belong to their party, stepped in after his wife very naturally, so that Emma found, on being escorted and followed into the second carriage by Mr. Elton, that the door was to be lawfully shut on them, and that they were to have a tête-à-tête drive. It would not have been the awkwardness of a moment, it would have been rather a pleasure, previous to the suspicion of this very day, she could have talked to him of Harriet, and the 3/4 of a mile would have seemed but one. But now she would rather it had not happened. She believed he had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine, and felt sure that he would want to be talking nonsense. To restrain him as much as might be, by her own manners, she was immediately preparing to speak with exquisite calmness and gravity of the weather and the night. But scarcely had she begun, scarcely had they passed the sweep-gate and joined the other carriage, than she found her subject cut up, her hand seized, her attention demanded, and Mr. Elton actually making violent love to her, availing himself of the precious opportunity, declaring sentiments which must be already well known, hoping, fearing, adoring, ready to die if she refused him, but flattering himself that his ardent attachment and unequalled love and unexampled passion could not fail of having some effect, and in short, very much resolved on being seriously accepted as soon as possible. It really was so. Without scruple, without apology, without much apparent diffidence, Mr. Elton, the lover of Harriet, was professing himself her lover. She tried to stop him, but vainly. He would go on, and say it all. Angry as she was, the thought of the moment made her resolve to restrain herself when she did speak. She felt that half this folly must be drunkenness, and therefore could hope it might only belong to the passing hour. Accordingly, with a mixture of the serious and the playful, which she hoped would best suit his half and half state, she replied, "I am very much astonished, Mr. Elton. This to me! You forget yourself. You take me for my friend. Any message to Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver, but no more of this to me, if you please." "Miss Smith! Message to Miss Smith! What could she possibly mean? And he repeated her words with such assurance of accent, such boastful pretence of amazement, that she could not help replying with quickness, "Mr. Elton, this is the most extraordinary conduct, and I can account for it only in one way. You are not yourself, or you could not speak either to me or of Harriet in such a manner. Command yourself enough to say no more, and I will endeavour to forget it." But Mr. Elton had only drunk wine enough to elevate his spirits, not at all to confuse his intellects. He perfectly knew his own meaning, and having warmly protested against her suspicion as most injurious, and slightly touched upon his respect for Miss Smith as her friend, but acknowledging his wonder that Miss Smith should be mentioned at all, he resumed the subject of his own passion, and was very urgent for a favourable answer. As she thought less of his inebriety, she thought more of his inconstancy and presumption, and with fewer struggles for politeness replied, "It is impossible for me to doubt any longer. You have made yourself too clear. Mr. Elton, my astonishment is much beyond anything I can express. After such behaviour as I have witnessed during the last month to Miss Smith, such attentions as I have been in the daily habit of observing, to be addressing me in this manner, this is an unsteadiness of character indeed, which I had not supposed possible. Believe me, sir, I am far, very far from gratified in being the object of such professions." "Good heaven!" cried Mr. Elton. "What can be the meaning of this? Miss Smith! I never thought of Miss Smith in the whole course of my existence, never paid her any attentions but as your friend, never cared whether she were dead or alive but as your friend. If she has fancied otherwise, her own wishes have misled her, and I am very sorry, extremely sorry. But Miss Smith, indeed! Oh, Miss Woodhouse! Who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? No, upon my honour, there is no unsteadiness of character. I have thought only of you. I protest against having paid the smallest attention to anyone else. Everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really seriously doubt it. No," in an accent meant to be insinuating, "I am sure you have seen and understood me." It would be impossible to say what Emma felt on hearing this, which of all her unpleasant sensations was uppermost. She was too completely overpowered to be immediately able to reply, and 2 moments of silence being ample encouragement for Mr. Elton's sanguine state of mind, he tried to take her hand again, as he joyously exclaimed, "Charming Miss Woodhouse, allow me to interpret this interesting silence. It confesses that you have long understood me." "No, sir," cried Emma, "it confesses no such thing. So far from having long understood you, I have been in a most complete error with respect to your views till this moment. As to myself, I am very sorry that you should have been giving way to any feelings. Nothing could be farther from my wishes. Your attachment to my friend Harriet, your pursuit of her, pursuit it appeared, gave me great pleasure, and I have been very earnestly wishing you success. But had I supposed that she were not your attraction to Hartfield, I should certainly have thought you judged ill in making your visits so frequent. Am I to believe that you have never sought to recommend yourself particularly to Miss Smith, that you have never thought seriously of her?" "Never, madam," cried he, affronted in his turn. "Never, I assure you, I think seriously of Miss Smith. Miss Smith is a very good sort of girl, and I should be happy to see her respectably settled. I wish her extremely well, and no doubt there are men who might not object to— Everybody has their level, but as for myself, I am not, I think, quite so much at a loss. I need not so totally despair of an equal alliance as to be addressing myself to Miss Smith. No, madam, my visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only, and the encouragement I received— Encouragement! I give you encouragement! Sir, you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend. In no other light could you have been more to me than a common acquaintance. I am exceedingly sorry, but it is well that the mistake ends where it does. Had the same behaviour continued, Miss Smith might have been led into a misconception of your views, not being aware, probably, any more than myself, of the very great inequality which you are so sensible of. But as it is, the disappointment is single, and I trust will not be lasting. I have no thoughts of matrimony at present." He was too angry to say another word. her manner too decided to invite supplication, and in this state of swelling resentment and mutually deep mortification they had to continue together a few minutes longer, for the fears of Mr. Woodhouse had confined them to a foot-pace. If there had not been so much anger, there would have been desperate awkwardness, but their straightforward emotions left no room for the little zigzags of embarrassment. Without knowing when the carriage turned into Vicarage Lane, or when it stopped, they found themselves all at once at the door of his house, and he was out before another syllable passed. Emma then felt it indispensable to wish him a good night. The compliment was just returned, coldly and proudly, and under indescribable irritation of spirits she was then conveyed to Hartfield. There she was welcomed with the utmost delight by her father, who had been trembling for the dangers of a solitary drive from Vicarage Lane, turning a corner which he could never bear to think of, and in strange hands, a mere common coachman, no James, and there it seemed as if her return only were wanted to make everything go well, for Mr. John Knightley, ashamed of his ill-humour, was now all kindness and attention, and so particularly solicitous for the comfort of her father as to seem, if not quite ready to join him in a basin of gruel, perfectly sensible of its being exceedingly wholesome, and the day was concluding in peace and comfort to all their little party, except herself. But her mind had never been in such perturbation, and it needed a very strong effort to appear attentive and cheerful, till the usual hour of separating allowed her the relief of quiet reflection. Chapter 15.
Oh, Mr. Elton. Oh, Emma. Oh, heck. Going back to the beginning of the chapters, there were a lot of little things that Jane Austen does in this chapter that I just think are fun, because it's like giving us Easter eggs to see if we're paying attention. Like John Knightley returns from Donwell with two of the boys, and that ensures a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding that they hastened home for. That is not a bowl of gruel. Everybody else in the household apparently is eating just fine, and Mr. Woodhouse must just be putting up with it. Either that or they're eating not where he can see them eating food like that. Otherwise, he'd be whining. There's a lot of free and direct speech in here. My favorite, I think, was when Emma was confused about why Mr. Elton would want to go to the party, even though Harriet wasn't there. And she's saying, how strange, most strange indeed, but there it is. I believe in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their employments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives way to it, especially single men. Oh, wow. I mean, sure, who wants to be left at home alone to eat by yourself when one could be out with friends? It's not just single men, but it is funny that she has to actively come up with a reason why he would be doing this. I also thought these were some of John Knightley's best chapters ever. Talking about Mr. Elton, I never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It is downright labor to him where ladies are concerned. That man is working it. He is really working hard, Mr. Elton is, to find a woman. I also thought it was interesting that John Knightley was complaining about having to go out into the cold, talking about we're going out with rather thinner clothing than usual because, of course, you're wearing your nicest clothes. You're not wearing work boots or anything like that. And while there seems to be some indications that everybody, if they were walking a distance in any kind of potential weather, would have worn a boot or a boot of some sort, it is very possible that because this was A, a short trip, and B, someplace where there was a sweep drive, so you would be dropped off at the door, you wouldn't have to walk through puddles or anything, that the women may have been wearing their slippers, their nice shoes to this outing. And so that bears some weight on Isabella's offer later to say, oh, I can get out of the carriage and walk, which we'll get to that. I think that is also really interesting of her. Also, just John Knightley's rant. We're setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house with nothing to say or hear that was not said and heard yesterday and may not be said and heard again tomorrow. Curmudgeon. Love that. Ah. And you heard Elton, dreadfully so, exactly so. So his tick is exactly so. Harriet's, to be sure. I also loved that by the time they got to the Westons' home, Mr. Woodhouse had been there long enough to get seated, to get all of the things that he needs around him, including Isabella, to have heard everything about everybody else's travels, and had just gotten to the point of his conversation with whoever was going to listen to him, making sure that James should come in to see his daughter. And I thought, okay, this is the coachman again. This is James, his daughter. I think her name is Hannah, right? Hannah's working for the Westons. And again, it's just one of those moments where you go, okay, Mr. Woodhouse can be a pain in the tuchus sometimes, but he doesn't forget people. He doesn't forget things about people he cares about, which cannot be said for everybody. There are plenty of people who care about a lot of things and a lot of people, but they're not always front of mind that way. I kind of like that about him. Other things, not so much, but that I like a lot. There is the setup for a running joke in this chapter. When Emma is sitting next to Mr. Weston at dinner, finally, and getting to hear about Frank Churchill, Mr. Weston says, he's been wanting to come to us ever since September. Every letter has been full of it, but he cannot command his own time. He has those to please who must be pleased, and who, between ourselves, and that's in parentheses, are sometimes to be pleased only by a good many sacrifices. That parenthetical, between ourselves, like looking over his shoulder, like just between the two of us, it will become clear that he has said the same thing many times to many, many people. So it does become a running joke just to listen for. You're going to hear Weston say this more than once. Which, again, he's another one. I just really like Mr. Weston a whole lot. And then chapter 15, the fateful chapter 15. I love the description that Mr. Elton is so excited to be there and so excited to talk to Emma that he talked for some time very properly, not much attending to any answer. A little more interested in talking than listening. There is a moment with Elton and Mrs. Weston, Miss Taylor, that I thought was an interesting little moment of insight into characterization. Elton is now talking about how much he hopes that Emma stays away from Harriet so that Emma doesn't get an ulcerated sore throat. And then he says, "Isn't this fair, Miss Weston? Judge between us. Have I not some right to complain about Emma risking her life to go visit Harriet? I'm sure of your kind support and aid." And Emma saw Mrs. Weston's surprise, because Elton should not be claiming this kind of, not dominion over, but this kind of territorial marking out. Don't I have a reason to be concerned about her? I, me, Elton, not us in general, people who care. Don't I have a reason to complain? Oof. And then Mr. Knightley, Mr. John Knightley, coming in like a bull in a china shop. "Hey, it's snowing. We got to get out of here." And boy, nothing is going to set Mr. Woodhouse off as fast or as hard as snow. We're going to have to travel through snow. Oh my God, it's going to be blizzards and enormous piles of snow all over the place. And there are no snow shovels out. There are no tractors to plow the roads. Yikes. I also loved, again, John Knightley. "I dare say we shall get home very well. Another hour or two snow can hardly make the road impassable, and we are now 2 carriages. If one is blown over in the bleak part of the common field, there will be another one on hand. I dare say we shall all be safe at Hartfield before midnight." If one is blown over, it's barely snowing at all. It's like a powder, which we learned from Mr. Knightley, who actually goes outside and checks on things, which again, I love. I also love that Mr. Weston is like, "Don't worry about a thing. If it gets really, really bad outside, y'all can spend the night here." And Mrs. Weston is saying, "I only have 2 spare bedrooms. I don't know how you think this is going to work, but dang, I better start thinking. And then Isabella. So we've already heard Mr. John Knightley saying that everybody is wearing lighter clothes than usual. And then Isabella is so concerned about her father and making sure that he is fine. She said, I dare say we shall be able to get along if we set off directly. And if we do come to anything very bad, I can get out and walk. I am not at all afraid. I should not mind walking half the way. And I thought, good for her. I mean, that's kind of a bully for you moment where, yeah, she's probably completely wrong and utterly misguided. And that would be a stupid, stupid, stupid idea. And she would get her death of cold. But also willing to pitch in. I can walk. I can get out and walk. I'm fine. Good for her. This is why I did not like the way she was characterized in the most recent Emma. She is not hypochondriacal Harridan. How's that? I also loved, Jane Austen obviously has to find a way to get Emma and Elton into the carriage alone together for this scene to work. And because John Knightley has been portrayed as the way he is, when Mr. Woodhouse gets settled and Isabella gets settled next to him, and Mr. John Knightley just hops on in the carriage without thinking twice, bye, y'all. That's a great plot point for Jane Austen, but also utterly believable. He's used to getting into the carriage after his wife. That's what he's been doing for the last however many years they've been married. But also, oops. Then there's the phrase making violent love. So the 20th century really screwed this phrase up. Wooing someone, a synonym for that would have been making love to them, where you are making your love for them apparent. Violent, as a poetic term, merely indicates the vehemence, the passion. It's like passionate love, but that would even be worse sounding in modern ears. But there's also an overlay when you add the violent to making love in this time period. There's also an overlay of kind of tactlessness. Like, really, you have crossed a line. It is one thing to be wooing someone. It is one thing to be making love to them, making your love known to them. It is another thing to be crossing a line, and he is crossing lines all over the place. He's also half drunk. I also love the free indirect speech, which is used almost as a Shakespearean aside here in Mr. Elton's brain, where Emma says at the very beginning of their horrible, horrible moment, I'm very much astonished, Mr. Elton. This to me? You forget yourself. You take me for my friend. Any message to Miss Smith I should be happy to deliver, but no more than this to me, if you please. Miss Smith? A message to Miss Smith? What could she possibly mean? That is both free indirect speech and also spoken aloud. That is how drunk he is. He's Miss Smith to Emma, and then out loud, but on his own. What could she mean? I don't get this. That is, gosh darn it, Jane Austen, such a good writer. There is a moment for Mr. Elton after he's made his first approach. And Mr. Elton says, everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really seriously doubt it. No. And then parenthetically, in an accent meant to be insinuating, I am sure you have seen and understood me. This is one of those classic moments where largely innocent girl has not realized that all of this attention from this guy isn't just being friendly. It is also the inverse of that. And gentlemen who are listening, I know this isn't you. We're not talking about you. But there are guys out there, I don't think they would be listening to this podcast, quite honestly, who any attention from a female means that female has more passionate thoughts about them than is probably true. It is a problem. It is a problem in our communication back and forth over the ages that this continues to happen. It is certainly happening here, where Emma really did not see what Elton is doing, as we know, because both John Knightley and Mrs. Weston pointed out to her that it looks like Elton is into you. You better restrain yourself. And she's just not buying it, which again is so interesting because she is beautiful and, popular. And yet, I guess partially because she has made it very clear that she's not interested in marriage, it just doesn't occur to her that anyone would be after her. Plus, she's invested so much time and effort into believing that Elton and Harriet are made for each other. So, charming Miss Woodhouse, allow me to interpret this interesting silence. That is the phrase that is used here. And I just love that. I loved also that at the end of Emma trying to back him off and, back it up, man. She said, "This disappointment is single and I trust will not be lasting. I have no thoughts of matrimony at the present," which is her way of saying, it's not you, it's me, so let's drop it. In Regency speak, it's not you, it's me. I also love that Mr. John Knightley, is so happy to be back at Hartfield at the end of this wild ride that he finds a bowl of gruel to be perfectly sensible, although not what he wants to eat. So I did promise a video for you, and we're going to try and play the audio track for the podcast listeners and the entire video and audio track if you are watching on YouTube. We think we can do this because this is an educational thing and it's a clip from an educational lecture series. It's not like Warner Brothers is going to be breathing down our neck. However, I am going to link out to the Intelligence Squared YouTube channel and to this video as well. Please, please, please do watch it. Give it a thumbs up. Let them know that you liked it if you get a chance to watch the whole thing, because the whole thing is spectacular. We are going to watch my favorite version of this scene between Elton and Emma in the carriage. If you have time to watch not quite the rest of this entire video, because it's almost 2 hours long, I would recommend that you at least hang on after this one long enough to watch Dominic West and Mariah Gale, who played Ophelia in David Tennant's Hamlet. She's stunning and just so good. So good. But the author of the Jane Austen book, which I think he did Jane Austen in Context. I'll link out to his book either way from the show notes. He selected this scene from Emma, but then he also selected the scene from the very first opening scene of Pride and Prejudice, except he removes the opening line. "It is a truth universally acknowledged." He just takes that out. And instead, it's just a domestic scene between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. And I have to tell you, I've never heard those words so differently as I did when he removed that opening bit. So it's worth a listen, especially if you love Jane Austen. I think it is very, very worth your while to get to hear both the Emma scene and also the Pride and Prejudice scene. The Emma scene is going to be done by Samuel West. If you've been watching Slow Horses, he's the awful Prime Minister slimeball right now, but he's so good as Elton in this little clip. And then Eleanor Tomlinson, who, if you watch the new Poldark, she was Demelza. And this was filmed in 2014. So this was 10 years ago. All right. So we have this and then a couple more things, and then I'll let you guys go. Here we go with the scene.
She tried to stop him, but vainly. He would go on and say it all. Angry as she was, the thought of the moment made her resolve to restrain herself when she did speak. She felt that half this folly must be drunkenness, and therefore could hope that it might belong only to the passing hour. Accordingly, with a mixture of the serious and the playful, which she hoped would best suit his half-and-half state, she replied,
"I am very much astonished, Mr. Elton. This to me? You forget yourself. You take me for my friend. Any message to Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver, but no more of this to me, if you please."
Miss Smith? A message to Miss Smith?
could she possibly mean? And he repeated her words with such assurance of accent, such boastful pretense of amazement, that she could not help replying with quickness.
Mr. Elton, this is the most extraordinary conduct, and I can account for it in only one way. You are not yourself. You could not speak either to me or of Harriet in such a manner. Command yourself enough to say no more, and I will endeavour to forget it.
But Mr. Elton had only drunk wine enough to elevate his spirits, not at all to confuse his intellect. He perfectly knew his own meaning, and having warmly protested against her suspicion as most injurious, and slightly touched upon his respect for Miss Smith as her friend, but acknowledging his wonder that Miss Smith should be mentioned at all, he resumed the subject of his own passion for it and was very urgent for a favourable answer. As she thought less of his inebriety, the more she thought of his inconstancy and presumption, and with fewer struggles for politeness, replied,
It is impossible for me to doubt any longer. You have made yourself too clear. Mr. Elton, my astonishment is much beyond anything I can express. After such behaviour as I have witnessed during the last month to Miss Smith, such attentions as I have been in the daily habit of observing, to be addressing me in this manner, this is an unsteadiness of character indeed, which I had not supposed possible. Believe me, sir, I am far, very far, from gratified in being the object of such professions.
Good heaven, what can be the meaning of this? Miss Smith? I never thought of Miss Smith in the whole course of my existence. Never paid her any attentions but as your friend. Never cared whether she were dead or alive, but as your friend. If she has fancied otherwise, her own wishes have misled her, and I'm very sorry, extremely sorry. But Miss Smith, indeed. Miss Woodhouse, who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? No, upon my honour, there is no unsteadiness of character. I have thought only of you. I protest against having paid the smallest attention to anyone else. Everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been done with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really, seriously doubt it. No!
In an accent meant to be insinuating,
I am sure you have seen and understood.
it would be impossible to say what Emma felt on hearing this. Which of all her unpleasant sensations was uppermost? She was too completely overpowered to be immediately able to reply, and 2 moments of silence being ample encouragement for Mr. Elton's sanguine state of mind, he tried to take her hand again as he joyously exclaimed,
Charming, Miss Woodhouse. Allow me to interpret this interesting silence. It confesses that you have long understood.
No, sir, it confesses no such thing. So far from having long understood you, I have been in a most complete error with respect to your views till this moment. As to myself, I am very sorry that you should have been giving way to any feelings, and nothing could be further from my wishes. Your attachment to my friend Harriet, your pursuit of her, or pursuit it appeared, gave me great pleasure, and I have been very earnestly wishing you success. But had I supposed that she were not your attraction to Hartfield, I should certainly have thought you judged ill in making your visits so frequent. Am I to believe that you never sought to recommend yourself particularly to Miss Smith? That you never thought seriously of her?
Never, ma'am. Never, I assure you. I think seriously of Miss Smith. Miss Smith is a very good sort of girl, and I should be happy to see her respectably settled. I wish her extremely well, and no doubt there are men who might not object to... Everybody has their level. But as for myself, I am not, I think, quite so much at a loss. I need not so totally despair of an equal alliance as to be addressing myself to Miss Smith. No, madam, my visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only. and the encouragement I receive.
Encouragement? I give you encouragement? Sir, you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend. In no other light could you have been more to me than a common acquaintance. I am exceedingly sorry, but it is well that the mistake ends where it does. Had the same behavior continued, Miss Smith might be led into a misconception of your views, not being aware, probably, any more than myself, of the very great inequality which you are so sensible of. But, as it is, the disappointment is single, and I trust will not be lasting. I have no thoughts of matrimony at present.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought too, and I didn't want to say it before you watched, but I really thought hearing an audience respond to Jane Austen is not something I think I've ever done before. I mean, we certainly enjoy the videos, the miniseries, the audiobooks, the things like that. Hearing an audience respond to just her words. I mean, these two actors were doing spectacularly. And if you have ever been interested in the theater, or if you have children who are interested in the theater, I cannot recommend a better teachable moment than watching the video version of this and watching Samuel West's face. One of the things that is so hard to do with teenagers in high school drama, and even honestly, God, we've seen plenty of off-Broadway plays where they have the same problem. They don't listen to each other. They're just waiting for their cue for their next line, and then they just jump on that. When you see an actor who is really listening, it gives weight to everything they say, but also weight to their scene partner. This is why actors will talk about being on camera and how important it is when Tom Cruise shows up every day, even though the camera's not going to be on him, he is there for the over-the-shoulder shots so that you, the new actor, the neophyte, the not Tom Cruise, have him to work off of because you're watching him listen to you and react. And that's enormous. It's fabulous. And that is not true of all big actors. It should be, but I don't know. I guess they need their beauty sleep or something. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Yes, Samuel West, everybody has their level. That had never struck me as funny before. But boy, the way he did it, yes, ma'am. Don't forget, we have a raffle for the month of May. This is Janice Designs. This is Amy Woolwine's shop on Etsy. We are so excited. There is the Jane Austen mug, What Would Jane Do? And the Emma bag. Pictures of these are on the screen if you are on YouTube. And if you are listening, you can see the pictures in the show notes and the links out to the store so you can see all the other fabulous things that Amy's got going. Please go there. Please grab some stuff. It's awesome. All those links are in the show notes or the description. And then the last thing I wanted to do is play you out with a voicemail we received from Liz, from Scare Liz, who's Scare Liz on Ravelry and everywhere else on the internet. I'm letting her play you out just because she's exuberant and I agree with everything she has to say. And I do want to add, Liz, if you have created a chart where you plot point the Emma chapter and the clueless scenes so that we can tell how you are seeing them connect, I would love to see that. Just saying. All right, here we go with Liz. Until next week, when I talk to you again, I'm signing off. I'm going to go lay down. Have a great one. Bye.
Hey, Heather. This is Sarah Blake, Scare Liz on the internet everywhere. I am a few episodes behind in Emma, but I'm really loving every time that you mention somebody being ADHD. I love that so many of Jane Austen's characters are like very obviously autistic or ADHD or both. Like you have Mr. Darcy, who won't dance with people he doesn't know and can't do small talk. You have Mr. Collins, who needs to prepare conversation points. Like so many people. While I was looking up information for this voice note, I found a review of a book that's actually about a bunch of characters from Pride and Prejudice being autistic. The book is called So Odd a Mixture, Along the Autistic Spectrum in Pride and Prejudice by Phyllis Ferguson Bottomer, which I now really want to read. But I think I called in and talked about this when you read Northanger Abbey too, where Catherine Morland is so absolutely ADHD, both in how she behaves in the book and how she's described as a child. And I think Emma and her family are also ADHD. I think her dad is like a slightly different type of autism than she is. You know, she always thinks she's right and gets like hyper fixated on her projects. She really likes Miss Bates, but finds her sort of holistic, good-natured small talk and gossip super boring. And she also cannot tell when she's being flirted with, which is just, you know, I feel like all of my autistic friends, we all bond over not knowing when somebody is flirting with us. Yeah, it's a problem. Her dad also thinks he's right all the time. He doesn't like to leave the house and needs his routines to be just the way they are. And like, he's allergic to change. He can't like imagine other people thinking differently from him. Like he has a really hard time taking on other people's perspectives. And he's got a lot of gut issues and sensory sensitivities. Like actually like being ill and like having gut issues is also a big like thing in autism. And it's not like it's a neurological and biological thing. Anyway, all this to say that probably Jane Austen was also autistic, and I will fight anyone who claims otherwise. Yeah. I also wanted to say that I still think the best Emma movie is Clueless, which is not to say that it's the closest to the book or even like the best adaptation, but that it's the best movie based on Emma. And I'm always comparing each chapter to that movie rather than any of the ones that are actually titled Emma. So yeah, Amy Heckerling, great. Such a good filmmaker. That is all. I can't wait to actually catch up with the podcast. All right, have a good one. Bye.
If you like what we do here, please consider liking and subscribing on iTunes, thumbs upping and subscribing on YouTube. You can visit patreon.com/craftlit and become a patron of this art. And you can always go to Linktree, linktr.ee/craftlit channel. And from there, you can get links out to all of the social media, all of the places that Craftlit lives. It's a nice hub that you can go to get all the stuff, all the good stuff. And I keep forgetting to mention, we also have a Facebook group with the loveliest group of people, as you might imagine. They're just awesome. Makers and readers. And people who hadn't been readers before, but are now. I like that. All right. You take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.